Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church here in Salt Lake City. You know, every once in a while, we are struck by the incongruence of Christian rhetoric used by conservative politicians with their total disregard for the poor or anyone in need. And I'm not merely referring to Ted Cruz, although he does set the bar pretty high. Jesus was concerned most with those society counted least and put last. A politically engaged spirituality can never neglect the plight of those most deprived and vulnerable, and will insist that improving the lot of the most oppressed is the decisive test of political sincerity. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. May we open our service turning our hymn books, please, to number 303. like to share for a moment, I had a rather proud feeling of being a Unitarian Universalist. Earlier this week, the president of Westminster College hosted a dinner at his home in honor of Sister Helen Prejean, who is the nun who wrote Dead Man Walking and has inspired the movie. And Sister Helen, by the way, does not look anything like Susan Sarandon, in case you're wondering. But it was a wonderful time, and it just so happened at one point there was just a conversation with just among Sister Helen and the Catholic Bishop John Wester and I, and we were chatting. And then she almost like interrupted herself, and she turned to me and she said, sort of, "Well, what do you do?" Because I didn't have a title or anything, just a name tag. What do you do? You know, explain yourself, account for being here. She's quite a live wire. And I said that I was minister of the First Unitarian Church here in Salt Lake City. And her face just lit up. And she said to the bishop, she says, "Now there is a church committed to social justice." And I thought, yes, indeed. During the dinner, she got up to speak, and she said, a little accusatorily, we're all people of privilege. And everyone went, "Oh, here it comes. You know, we're going to get hit by a nun about how our privileged situation." And she said, "Well, you know, I'm a person of privilege too. It's not really that bad being a person of privilege. It's just that we don't know very much." Whew. Okay, and we all kind of agreed that was indeed the case. O Spirit of life and love, we embrace the silence with the prayers of our hearts. May we receive and give these gifts and blessings. A word of welcome for the stranger, a heart of warmth for all whom we meet, a thought of gladness for those whom we love, a moment of quiet grace for our souls, strong hope every day. Amen. Is anyone familiar with the story of Antoinette Tufts? Do you know who she is? Okay, her story may sound familiar. Perhaps you remember the story about Antoinette Tufts. She's the woman in Atlanta, Georgia, who was working in the main office of an elementary school when a man burst in with an automatic rifle and 500 rounds of ammunition. Everyone got out, thanks to her. No one was hurt because she talked to the man, and he heard her. And she talked to the police outside through the 911 operator, and they heard her too. The chief of police in Atlanta said there is no question that this could have been, and almost was, another Newtown, Connecticut, but it wasn't, thanks to her. There is a recording of the 911 call placed by Antoinette Tufts from her office. In it, you can hear clearly how she's speaking at once to the operator and to the man by her side with the rifle, conveying his demands and his questions, his intention to kill dozens of people. You can hear her relaying back responses from the police, who by now number in the hundreds outside the school with helicopters, weapons, and riot gear, how without fail she addresses him as Sir so naturally, with no tremor or hypocrisy at all, the way she might address a teacher in the school or a parent or the principal, with plain decency, Southern courtesy. How at some point in that eternal 13 minutes, Sir became baby. What's your name, baby? Michael Hill. Oh, my mother was a Hill. This is an African-American bookkeeper speaking like this to a young white man in Georgia who's just told her he's mentally unstable and off his medication. A man with a serious weapon who's just said he has nothing left to live for and means to start shooting any minute. She says to him, I know, we all go through something in life. I almost committed suicide myself last year when my husband left me, but I didn't. And look at me now. It's going to be all right, baby. You're going to be all right. They're not going to shoot you. We're not going to hate you. That's a brave thing you're doing, giving yourself up. I'm proud of you. She said this after she got him to lie down and lay his gun aside, assuring him that she would stay standing when the police came in so they would know he hadn't hurt her. She said, I love you. You're all right. All the while calling him Michael, calling him baby, sweetie, sweetheart, and sir. In the days that followed, a talk show psychologist praised Ms. Tufts, telling CNN that she had deployed excellent instrumental strategy and an exemplary negotiating style. All this may be true, but she herself had a different explanation, and it involved no strategy at all, and it was certainly not about her style. She said that what got her through was the teaching of her church to, and I quote, anchor on the Lord in tough times. She anchored on the Lord. Now, the person who sent me the article sent a question in her email. What could that mean for us? By the way, the writer here is a Unitarian Universalist minister. And so one of her parishioners sent the article and then asked, what would that mean for us? What does that mean? The love she talks about sounds a lot like universalism, like standing on the side of love, but how are we to talk about it? Anchor on the Lord may sound a little churchy to you, or a little too religious, or a lot, too old-fashioned, too theistic, too Baptist, too Christian. So what would you call it? What do you call it standing up in what Miss Tuff called tough times? What do you call that courage, that radical love, radical empathy, radical grace? What holds your moral roots in place? What holds you to your highest aspiration, your deepest truth, your calling, your longing, your conviction? Good religion requires good language, clear thinking, but you can't overthink it or you might miss your moment trying to reason it out. In Antoinette's tough situation, there wasn't time. Reason and logic could have understandably led to panic, but she wasn't looking for logic, and she wasn't praying for courage or strength, safety or strategy, quick wit or a way out. She was praying, she said afterwards, for sufficient love. Love large enough to hold Michael, to see the other person in the room, whatever the circumstances, not as a deranged gunman, nor even as a threat, but ever and always as a human being, someone with a story and a struggle just like her, and also singular, a child of God, a person full of his own worth and dignity. It is truly a delight to welcome not only everyone, but a special welcome to those who have ventured here for the very first time this morning, just waiting for a beautiful Sunday morning to usher your way into the First Unitarian Church. And it is our intent to get to know everyone, especially those who are here for the first time. And one of the ways we are helped in that endeavor is by asking those who are here for the first time, would you please take a moment to stand up so we can identify who you are and grab you at coffee hour following the service. Please stand if you're here for the very first time. Great. Welcome. And upstairs. In the balcony. Thanks very much. Thank you. We also have a wonderful welcome table to help you find out all the exciting things happening in this congregation, and the announcements in the order of service are a dead giveaway about how busy we are, and we have so many fingers and so many pies. It's just amazing. Let me just bring your attention to just a couple of announcements that are a little time sensitive. Usually on the first Monday night of every month, we have a wonderful supper for young families with small children. The date is not going to be on April 6th, this month of April, or next month of April, but on the 13th, due to spring break. Spring break this year has been very odd. It seemed like every classroom in the whole valley has had their own spring break. I mean, it's just, I don't know, we've had spring break since Christmas. But I think it's finally over when Easter comes and goes. And then the following Sunday on the 12th, we will have a child dedication service. And if you want to have your child dedicated, which is really a naming ceremony and just a blessing for a little one who is new to this world, please see me or our religious educator following the service. Many of you might know that I'm involved in the summer teaching for the University of Utah up in Montana for the Environmental Humanities program. And there's one course that I teach. I actually teach two courses. One course is open. It's not only a 3-credit course for students, but it also allows the general public to come in and engage as well. It's on spiritual ecology, and it runs from August 4th to August 9th. In the beautiful Centennial Valley in Montana. It's only about 5 hours from Salt Lake City. And if you have the time and the inclination to join us up there, we have actually room for 4 more adults. We're full with students. We have 4 more adults. If you're interested at all, want to know more, please see me following the church service. And then finally, as you know, our pledge drive keeps moving along. There's good news, there's bad news. The good news is, up to this date, we have $350,000 in pledges. The bad news is we're $150,000 shy of our goal. $150,000 shy. So I don't think I need to say much more than that. If you haven't filled out your pledge card, and even if you're only remotely connected to this church and you want to see it continue strong, please fill out a pledge card. The table will be right here as you go out into the social hall, and it would be very much appreciated. The offering will now gratefully be received, and a chance to greet one another and wish each other a splendid Sunday morning. There's a rumor going around for some time now insisting that America has changed. Our country, it seems, has essentially purged itself of all racial injustice, where in today's America, no laws exist anymore that hold minorities back from equal opportunities. It's a fair game for everyone. This rumor plays well in this, the sesquicentennial year, since approximately 4 million slaves were freed. It was March of 1865 that Yankee armies crisscrossed the Deep South and unlocked the gates of about 1,000 plantations. We hear how times have changed in these past 150 years. We have a black president in his second term. The Supreme Court has ruled that our society has changed so much just since the 1965 Voting Rights Act was signed into law that we don't need to monitor voter suppression any longer. Everything has changed. We have the New South, we have a new black middle class, we have a level playing field which renders affirmative action as simply unnecessary. But the black poet and playwright Claudia Rankine contradicts this notion of how much our nation has changed. We can't pretend that everything is now equal without some accounting of a brutal history in which African Americans were subjected to unthinkable, inhumane treatment. In a recently published book called Citizen, Claudia Rankine writes, "The world is wrong. You can't put the past behind you. It's buried in you. It's turned your flesh into its own cupboard. Not everything remembered is useful, but it all comes from the world to be stored in you." I wondered how the world stored inside the cupboard of Antoinette Tuff, the elementary school office worker from Atlanta, the subject of our reading this morning. Black bookkeeper in Georgia, as the story goes, seizes power over a deranged white man ready to kill as many people as possible. But it seems she reached, unconsciously perhaps, she reached inside her cupboard and drew upon a distinct history of black women. They know of tough times, but they also remember from their ancestry the role of black women caring for and nurturing white children. She addressed the perpetrator first as Sir, then Michael, and finally, as though cradling him in her arms, she calls him sweetie and baby. And what keeps her strong remains what it has always been for oppressed people of color, the teachings of her church to anchor on the Lord in tough times. Can we honestly say that our country has changed in race relations? There may no longer be the rural incarceration of millions of slaves, but we face today the mass incarceration of 1 million black men. There may no longer be the law that prohibited black literacy, but there's an effort now to defund schools in low-income neighborhoods. There may no longer be slave patrols who seized young black men who did not have proper papers, giving them permission to to be away from their masters. But now we have stop and search policing, frisking, sprung from racial profiling. And we know the fate of many unarmed young black men. There's a thread that ties us to the past. The unrest in Ferguson did not erupt spontaneously. The militarization of the police in most of our large urban centers is not a sudden occurrence. This week, you may have seen, the New York Times wrote about the deadly force used by the police in Philadelphia over the past 8 years. It was about 3 weeks ago, maybe 4, that the New Yorker magazine covered the deadly force used by the police in Albuquerque. And the March on Selma earlier this month was more than just a 50-year commemoration. It was a loaded event because, as the president made clear, things really haven't changed that much. The roots of oppression have an extensive history. Nothing that can be resolved by talking about race with your barista at Starbucks. If you missed this recent effort by Starbucks to address race issues in America through conversation, the experiment was mercifully put to rest after Starbucks was asked to examine the racial makeup of its own corporate board. There's a thread that ties us to the past, although history has often been whitewashed in its accounting of how things really happened. Our history books fail to address past injustices so that we act naively today with no context for the new avenues of oppression that echo the Jim Crow era of yesteryear. A case in point, Brian Stevenson, a civil rights attorney, together with his organization Equal Justice Initiative, have made plans to build historic markers and memorials at lynching sites throughout the South. It's a way of forcing communities and the country as a whole to confront an era of racial terror, and perhaps even more significantly, the role that terror played in shaping the current racial landscape. You can't put the past behind you. It's buried in you. The hangings, burnings, dismemberment of black American men, women, and children were public events and relatively common in this country between the Civil War and World War II. These horrific conditions were usually public events, advertised in newspapers, drawing hundreds, even thousands of white spectators, including elected officials and leading citizens who posed with their children for photographs within an arm's length of mutilated black corpses. The Equal Justice Initiative released a report last month that chronicles 4,000 lynchings of black citizens in 12 southern states from 1877 to 1950. The report describes racial terror lynchings, which were used to enforce Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. Victims were often murdered without being accused of actual crimes, but for social transgressions like talking back to white people or asking for basic human rights. The Equal Justice Initiative report, which took 5 years to compile, makes the compelling argument that lynching serves as the precursor of modern-day racial bias in the criminal justice system. The decline of lynching as a mechanism of social control has merely shifted to capital punishment strategy, in which black men are frequently executed after expedited trials. And not only is the South cluttered with plaques, statues, and monuments that represent leaders of white supremacy, but right now the Supreme Court must decide if several states have the right to honor the Confederacy on their license plates. Now, I don't know if people are cruel or just stupid. But to glorify the symbol of slavery reveals either an unintended disconnect from the past or a deliberate show of force by white oppressors who fear their power slipping away. In deconstructing history, we learn that the heroes and victims of the past were not necessarily the heroes and victims that we were taught. I probably need to go no further than our beloved first President George Washington. We are taught that aside from his gallant leadership at the time of the American Revolution, the only controversy surrounding him was whether or not he chopped down a cherry tree and the degree of his discomfort while wearing wooden false teeth. But it's not really that benign. We may be shocked to discover, mainly through the research of black historian Professor Erica Armstrong Dunbar, that when George married Martha in 1759, she brought with her into the marriage 80 slaves, adding to his own. On the eve of the American Revolution, Washington had 150 slaves counted as part of his property. Embarking on the presidency in 1789, Washington used and sanctioned black slavery. He needed them, he said. He confessed. He told the world. He needed them to maintain his wealth and lifestyle. During the president's 2 terms in office, George and Martha relocated first to New York and then to Philadelphia. Although slavery in the North began to decline at the time, George Washington decided he could not live without it. But in Philadelphia, the president encountered his first roadblock to slave ownership. In Pennsylvania's Grand Abolition Act of 1780, the law stated that any slave who entered Pennsylvania with an owner would automatically be set free in 6 months. To circumvent this problem, George Washington sent his slaves back to Mount Vernon every 6 months, only to have them re-enter Pennsylvania for a new 6-month period. 1796, that year, Ona Judge, Martha Washington's longtime slave, who served as first attendant and took care of all of Martha Washington's personal needs, bolted from that home and made her way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she eventually married a free black man. She ran after discovering that Martha was going to give this slave, Ona Judge, give her as a wedding present to her granddaughter. George Washington, who signed the first fugitive slave law, pursued Ona Judge for 3 years, up until a few months before his death. At the time of his death in 1799, the Washingtons had 318 slaves. Race has been an issue since the time the father of our country decided that his wealth and lifestyle trumped the dignity of other human beings. Oppression of the black race was endorsed by the highest public official of our land, and the right to full freedom and full citizenship remained an unresolved issue then, as it does still for us today. You can't put the past behind you. It's buried in you. Deconstructing history literally means taking apart. It involves a vigorous reinterpreting of history based on certain predispositions, attitudes, assumptions, and ideologies. Winston Churchill famously said that history is written by the victors. We know that on some level, but we fail to integrate the fact that the history we are taught and the history taught to our children are written by those in power in society, those who may easily marginalize or silence or misrepresent other less powerful groups. The shooting of black, unarmed young men by white police officers all around the nation triggers the need for a new look, a new interpretation of that history that can't be left behind. The country is wrong. You can't just forget about the past. Black historians, black poets, black attorneys are engaged in seeking the truth about the past, which has either been denied or entirely rewritten for the sake of perpetuating a myth that racial justice exists in America today. In deconstructing history that we have been fed for decades, today's leaders of all colors must seek a truth that speaks beyond the easy history responsible for the current attitudes about race. What we face today, in my humble opinion, is what I can only call a pre-understanding about race. A pre-understanding imprinted upon our culture after decades of terror waged against African Americans by white supremacists. We have a pre-understanding of the role of force to maintain the status quo of white privilege. Our interpretation of history is what shapes our belief system, and our belief system shapes our interpretation of history. If one believes that black lives are inferior to white lives, then the principle that respects the inherent worth and dignity of all people becomes a moot point. So how do we begin really to discuss? How do we begin to negotiate? How do we begin to reconstruct history so that it can become relevant and meaningful to our present situation? The psychologist Carl Jung makes a good point when he writes, "The serious problems in life are never really solved. If ever they should appear to be so, it's a sure sign that something has been lost. The meaning and purpose of a problem seem not to be in its solution, but in our working at it incessantly." And for me, the caveat is that we cannot work on the problem of race relations because we bring to the table entirely different interpretations of history. And yet we must be working on it incessantly if we want to seriously engage in finally creating justice. For me, this tangle of sensibilities and assumptions and interpretations goes back to the heart of the story about Antoinette Tuff. In hard times, she is made acutely aware that there is, in fact, insufficient love in this world. In hard times, we don't really see the other people in the room. Our little-known fourth UU principle states that we affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Truth and meaning forever linked. We cannot find meaning in that which is not true. For Antoinette Tuft, the resounding truth revealed in the midst of the struggle was our cultural attitude of indifference to one another, especially in tough times. Her story speaks to us because ultimately she brought truth and meaning to our attention. Not a solution, but a search for truth and meaning. Claudia Rankine brought truth and meaning to the table by saying, the world is wrong. You can't put the past behind you. It's buried in you. It's turned your flesh into its own cupboard. Not everything remembered is useful, but it all comes from the world to be stored in you. We're never going to solve the issues of race in this country. Too many cupboards are filled with tough times, but we need to work on it incessantly. We can't buy into the rumor that it's all changed now. It's all good and fair. But if anything is to be drawn from blacks and whites working together to create a just society, the meaning will only be found once we are ready to embrace the truth more fully. The meaning relates to a radical love or just a sufficient love in tough times. The other person is a human being with a story, with a struggle, a person full of worth and dignity. Amen. May we close our service turning our hymn books, please, to number 300. As we extinguish the chalice, may new strength and bright hope fill us as we journey forth. May our lives touch others, and may we be touched, nourished, and transformed this day.